Hello and welcome to Business Talk, brought to you by the Sharonville Chamber of Commerce. I'm Britt Scarce with Emory Federal Credit Union. I'm your host, and today here in studio I have Karl Ulrich with Sebaly, Shillito Dyer, and Pandy Pridemore from The Human Resource USA, here to talk to us about medical leave. Karl, Pandy, welcome.
Hello.
Hi, Britt.
How you guys doing?
Doing well.
So medical leave, whenever I get sick, can I just have like 6 months off and everything's going to be okay?
Sometimes. I certainly hope so, Britt.
I have a cold. I'm gonna need 6 months off with pay.
And you just started yesterday, right?
Yeah, that's right. I know I just started yesterday,
Yeah.
but is it okay if I have 6 months off?
Well, you know, this is a great topic, and this is actually Karl's idea, because
Okay.
we haven't touched on this at all.
Okay.
And the reason we felt it was important is that there's so many misconceptions around medical leave, and we need to kind of dice that down a little bit and help companies understand the ways to approach it and the things that they need to consider before they, number one, write policies around medical leave, and then number two, publish policies around medical leave.
So it sounds to me like you guys have seen some ways that it's been done inappropriately.
Oh my gosh. And you know, one of the first things we want to start out with is medical leave can come in different ways.
Okay.
Okay, so one of the first questions is the medical leave work-related,
Okay.
which would file under a workers' comp claim?
So if I fall off my roof putting up Christmas lights, that doesn't count?
It's a medical,
It's a medical thing.
it might need a medical leave, but it certainly wouldn't fall into workers' comp.
Right.
So those sets of rules are set different.
Okay.
And then you've got a personal injury.
Yeah. So I'm at work and I get my finger cut off in a machine doing, my job.
Right, workers' comp.
Workers' comp. Okay. So what are the differences? What do you think, Karl?
Well, I mean, it's going to depend on the circumstance, but you have workers' comp system is designed to compensate injured workers, people who get injured in the workplace. So there's a whole structure, there's a whole system around that. All employers are aware of that. They're required to take part in that process. But where the real issues come up aren't so much in those workers' comp claims. We deal with those as separate, distinct types of claims. But in situations where you might not have a workplace injury, somebody falls off a roof putting up Christmas lights, injures their back, they have surgery and they're laid up for 12 weeks, which is not an unusual scenario.
Sure.
Can they get their job protected? If they're off of work for 12 weeks, is their job protected?
Right.
And to some extent, it may depend upon the size of the employer, may depend upon the nature of the disability or the condition. But oftentimes we start with what policies does a company have in place? What policies and procedures have they established for all their employees to cover situations involving unanticipated medical problems? Because human beings are unpredictable, right?
Yeah,
we all get these situations, and we have to deal with them somehow, and we don't want to necessarily lose our jobs. And if we're employers, we don't want to have to terminate people because they can't come to work for a few weeks. So we start with a good policy, and we should probably talk a little bit about what a good policy should look like.
Yeah. Are we talking about just the number of days you get, or are we talking about pay? Are we talking
Everything
everything
involved.
Because I mean, there's a certain point where like short-term disability needs to kick in as
There you
far as
go.
pay and that sort of thing, and then if it's a long-term thing, long-term disability.
But that might be in place as an insurance policy for, in lieu of workers' comp. But on top of that are all the considerations around, as Karl said, American Disabilities Act, the Family Medical Leave Act, the Pregnant Workers Act, which is becoming very, very popular and very state-driven above the American Disabilities Act.
I was just at a chamber luncheon this week, and a couple of ladies were standing there talking as we were all standing there networking and everything, and one of them talked about being on just coming back from having a baby, and one said I got 6 weeks, one said I had 12 weeks, another one said they had 20 weeks or 18 weeks. I mean, there's
It's
all these different. I'm thinking, isn't it a standard thing, or
Yeah.
it's not?
Well, and things like pregnancy leave, for example, there are usually some caps to that. There may be a 3-month program where a woman can take time off to give birth and to care for a newborn child. There may be policies where a spouse can do the same thing. But I think when you start designing a policy, what you got to do is you got to think about all the situations you're intending to cover here. So what do you do in a workplace policy? I think one of the things you don't want to do is you don't want to necessarily make an arbitrary cap to time off of work. You're off for 4 weeks, you can't come back to work, we're going to fire you. That kind of policy is dangerous because there are a lot of rules.
We still see them.
Oh my gosh.
And a lot of rules that require employers to job protect, to protect positions much longer than that.
Yeah.
And it may depend on the circumstances. So when you design a policy, you really got to think about, first of all, who's this going to cover? Is this going to cover everybody who's full-time? Is it going to cover part-time people? Is it going to cover only those employees who've been there for a year? Or is it going to cover everybody from the day that they start?
Yeah.
What are the eligibility requirements? Question number one. What sorts of triggers? When is the leave going to kick in? What do they have to be asking leave for? Is it
Do you have to use all your vacation before that kicks in? Or
That's a question
That's a
that
good
the
question.
policy would address.
Yeah. I think in most cases it's a good idea if you're an employer, I think you can do it a number of different ways, but I think if you're going to say you're going to grant somebody medical leave, one of the ways to do that is to say, okay, the medical leave is going to start on date X, and we're going to begin drawing down whatever available vacation you have as part of that leave. That way they get paid for part of that time off. It doesn't have to be paid for the balance, but if they're drawing down their vacation, that's probably fair for a period of time, but you don't have to do that. You can run them consecutively. You can run them concurrently. It's really a choice the employer has to make.
Okay. Now, so if I use all my vacation and it takes a little bit longer, if I try to come back because I fear I'm gonna lose my job, and I come back before I'm well, and then I can't perform my job correctly. I mean, that seems like that doesn't help anybody.
Well, but that should be part of the policy,
policy,
is that a physician's return to work should be required, listing any restrictions or limitations. That's for the safety of the employee.
Yeah.
That's not just an employer-driven concern.
What's usual for the time for it to kick in? I mean, what's a normal time period? Do people usually say you have to be there for a certain? I mean, is it normal that you have to work there at a place for a year before this would kick in?
I think in many cases there is a requirement that you be with the company for a period of time. FMLA, for example, doesn't kick in for a full year. If you have to be employed for basically a year and have a minimum number of hours of work before you actually get job protected leave under the Family Medical Leave Act. But from a policy perspective, I think it's wise to require people to have some tenure with the company before policy kicks in. So if you're going to do a policy that's broader than an FMLA policy, applies to other things besides serious health conditions, maybe you wait for 6 months before employees can avail themselves of the leave.
Now, should that cover both men and women? I know that sounds.
The answer is yes. Yeah. I mean, the short answer is yes.
It was a rhetorical question, right? But it was a rhetorical question.
But I think I know where you were going with that.
Well, where I'm going with that is normally, the dad.
I do love you.
Good. But what I meant by that, I wasn't trying to be funny. I was, because I mean, can men take off when their child is born for a certain amount of time and get that time off?
Sure.
I mean,
sure.
I don't see it as often, but
it's up to the company. And let me rephrase that. It's up to the company who doesn't offer FMLA. Okay. If they don't have FMLA, then there's a really good chance that they can deny that if they think it's in the best interest of the company. But let's flip back over to ADA. And remember, some of this stuff just layers and layers and layers. So you're not dealing with just one aspect, you're dealing with multiple aspects. So that's why Karl's really trying to define how that policy must look, because you've got so many other things you have to consider as you're writing that policy. Your policy cannot supersede the FMLA.
Right.
It cannot supersede or overdo the ADA. And if somebody's employed for a month and all of a sudden they say, hey, I need to go into rehab, or I have a bad knee or something, I need some medical attention, they might fall under that, and you may have to give them some time off under ADA.
Okay.
So there's so many moving parts with this. Maybe something very important to stress too is that FMLA, ADA, that's not paid time. That's unpaid time.
Okay.
And a lot of
So
companies...
they hold your job, but you don't get paid.
Exactly, exactly. And a lot of companies right now, just to stay competitive and for employee retention, are offering paid maternity and paid paternity time off, which I think is just so generous.
Yeah.
It's
Very,
generous.
very generous.
It is generous, and it's becoming more common, I think, as time goes on. It's harder to retain employees now in a tough economy, and so or in a good economy and a tough labor market. So so those benefits are becoming more common. But I think there are other things that employers have to be concerned about as they're drafting these policies. One of the things to keep in mind is that as employees return from medical leave, the question is always going to be, are they really ready to come back to work? And as Pandy, I think, alluded to here, I think we're going to be very careful that when employees come back to work, they're really ready from a medical standpoint to resume their job duties. And in tough...
You don't want them to injure themselves or someone else, because they're physically not well.
Exactly, and that's not...
Out of fear of losing their job.
That's a terrible thing for the employee, and it's bad for the employer too, because that they don't want to lose an employee by having somebody come back prematurely. So what do you do to prevent that? Well, you build into your policy the option of requesting what's called a return to work exam by a physician. In many cases, you can ask an employee before they resume their duties to be examined by a physician and have that physician certify that they're able to come back and resume those job functions. And the way you do that typically is you'd provide the physician with a job description or some generic description of what that employee does and say, okay, now based on their medical situation currently, are they ready to resume fulfill those job duties on a regular, if it's a full-time job, 40-hour work week kind of thing. And you get that in writing, and that goes in the employee file. So that's something you build into the policy. And I think, if there's an understanding that that's the case up front when an employee asks for medical leave, there's less of a surprise, less of a pushback when they are ready to come back to work and you say, well, now wait a minute. We just want to make sure you're ready. Do this first.
I call those essential work functions. And my clients all hear that from me and I've got a gentleman right now that broke his wrist. I have another gentleman who had back injuries. So those essential work functions got so basic that, okay, this individual has to be able to pull and push 1,200-pound piece of equipment. This person needs to be able to have, at least the sight of one eye. And when I'm talking, we're going down to fundamentals, real basics, but it has to have the function of one eye to see a keyboard and the use of 5 fingers to type. It needs to have a voice to speak to clients over the phone. Now, it doesn't mean they have to have 2 legs to work on a computer, but the other guy who's pulling and pushing 1,200 pounds, absolutely. He might not have the sight in both eyes, but if he can pull and push a piece of equipment. So that's just how basic, and that it gives the physician the opportunity to say, hey, no, if this is what's expected of you on a daily basis, you're not ready for this. And this is the light duty I'm recommending, or these are the restrictions. And a lot of job descriptions don't go to that extent. This is great information for workers' comp, as well as determining whether an accommodation can be made for ADA. It's just great information that most employers aren't even thinking about.
Well, medical leave is something that every employer has to deal with. And this is great information. I feel like we just scratched the surface, but our guests have been Karl Ulrich with Sebaly, Shillito Dyer and Pandy Pridemore from the Human Resource USA. We've been talking about medical leave. So you've been watching Business Talk right here. And until next time, have a good night.